Would you turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 11, please? Daniel chapter 11. This is one of the most central passages that deals with the coming Antichrist, who will come after the rapture of the church. If you remember the end of chapter 9, you will see what is called the 70 weeks prophecy. We went through that. And by the way, I keep reminding that all the sermons are on the website. If you don't do internet and you want the MP3s, just go to the sound booth. That way you could catch up. But at the end of chapter 9, we saw what is called the 70 weeks prophecy. And so what we'll see expanded in chapter 11, we'll see elements of the 70 weeks or the final 7 years of human history. In verses 1 through 35, if you remember, over the last 2 times, we saw it shows the fate of Israel up until the first coming of the Messiah, and it shows their fate until the rapture. And then starting in verse 36, we will see the actual 70th week, or the last 7 years of human history, and what happens up to the second coming of the Messiah. Now listen carefully, because between verses 35 and 36, there's a large gap of time. We left off last time with him talking about the king of Syria. And so what he's doing now is he jumps hundreds of years into the future between verse 35 and verse 36. How many hundreds of years, you ask? We don't know. We're still counting. We're still in that period of time before the 70th week. But he jumps to the 70th week and prophecies that will happen during that time. So verses 1 through 35 of chapter 11, from our standpoint, is now history. It's already happened. But when Daniel wrote it, some 600 years before Christ, it was all future. In fact, if you study those first 35 verses, there are 135 specific prophecies. And every one of those prophecies came through exactly as Daniel had predicted it. And just as the prophecies in the first 35 verses literally came through, the prophecies from verses 36 to 45 will also come through. Now, let me set a contextual note before we get going. And the question we can ask is, how do we know that when you come to verse 36, that you are coming to a different time? And how do you know he is just simply continuing with Antiochus Epiphanes that we talked about? And so I want you to see as a precursor, and you see it there on the screen, how do we know the 70th week starts with verse 36? And there are at least 5 ways that we know. The first way is we see that he's simply called the king. Look at verse 36. Well, let's start in verse 35. He says, some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end of time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. He's not called the king of the north. If you remember, we've been talking about that before. We've been talking about the king of the north and the king of the south. He's not called the king of the north. He's simply called the king. And so we see that's a difference. Letter B, verse 35 mentions the end of time. Look, we see in verse 35 where it says that it is the end and it is still to come. Now this is important because it serves as a notice that the events that will follow, beginning in verse 36, speak of a future time. But that should not surprise us, because according to the angel's own words in Daniel chapter 10 and verse 14, the scope of this prophecy would include the latter days. It would be something latter. Look at Daniel 10:14. Now I have come to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people in the latter days. For the vision pertains to the days yet future. Remember, chapter 10 is a precursor to the vision. Chapter 11 is the vision, finishing up in chapter 12. And so he's saying in chapter 10, in the precursor, this deals with your people's future. All right? Letter C, the first 35 verses were fulfilled in history. Now, those prophecies are fulfilled precisely, and we spent the last 2 weeks outlining historically how they were fulfilled. But when you come to verses 36 through 45, there is no historical correspondence to the events that are described there. And we'll see those in just a few minutes. Letter D, we see the word indignation in verse 36. He says in verse 36, he says, "Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished." He speaks of a time when the indignation is finished. This is a reference to the final outpouring of God's wrath during the final 7 years of the world. This is the tribulation period. And then letter E, Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2 tells us that there will be a resurrection. Look at chapter 12 and verse 2. He says, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt." Now we know this resurrection happens at the end. The resurrection has not happened yet. So this is a future time. This is something between verse 35 and 36. There's a gap of time, and it refers to the future. So that was just setting the context. And now beginning in verse 36, he begins to set the tone here for the coming Antichrist. We've already seen Antiochus Epiphanes, who was, in essence, a type of the Antichrist. He displayed some of the characteristics that the Antichrist will display. But we'll see that there's some differences, all right? So notice secondly in your notes, we see the blasphemies of the Antichrist. His blasphemies. There will be many ways that he will be blasphemous. Notice the first one. We see the royal pride of the Antichrist. Now, we're going to see his pride expressed in a few ways. Let's look at verse 36 and then we'll explain. We're going to see his pride. Verse 36, "Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done." And so we notice the first way we see his pride is that he will act in self-will. That's number one. It says in verse 36 again, "Then the king will do as he pleases." Now, one of the names given to the Antichrist is the willful king. And this verse bears that title out. Here is a man who wants to make all of his own decisions. He will do according to his own will. He is an absolute dictator who will rule with utter selfishness and utter self-will. And behind the scenes, moving him along, is Satan himself. And so he's a willful person. Notice the second way he shows his pride. He will exalt himself. And verse 36 says, "Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god." So here he is, he's the devil's man, and so he will act like Satan. Remember, it was Satan who said, "I will be like the Most High." Remember when he rebelled and was thrown out of heaven? So Satan says, "I will be like the Most High God." This Antichrist will do the same thing. He will arrogantly assert himself above every so-called deity and even God himself. Look at how he's described in 2 Thessalonians 2, 1-4. "Now we request of you, brethren, with the regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure or be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter or as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. You following the flow there? The Thessalonians here had received some letter or some information that the day of the Lord had come. And they thought that they had missed the rapture. They had known that the rapture would happen, then the tribulation, and then the second coming of Christ. But they thought they had missed the rapture, that they were in the day of the Lord. And so Paul said to them, that's not the case. The day of the Lord will not come until the person he describes here as the man of lawlessness has to come first. He further describes him in verse 4, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. And then we see back in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, where it describes him, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. 1 week refers to 7 years. But in the middle of the week or 7 years, he will put a stop to a sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So this is a reference to the coming Antichrist. He will come, he will make a covenant with the people of Israel for 7 years, but in the middle of the 7 years, he will break it. And he will go into the temple and he will declare himself to be God. Last time we saw Antiochus Epiphanes and how he went into the temple. He erected a statue of Zeus. He slaughtered a pig on the altar and he forced the priests to eat the meat. They didn't eat pork. And so he made the temple desolate. He made an abomination. This Antichrist, when he goes in, he won't have to sacrifice anything. He will just go in and say, I am God. And so the Antichrist will ultimately oppose every form of religion. All that is worship, all deities, all shrines, all altars, all images. And everything will take second place to him. Notice the third way. He'll blaspheme the true God. It says in verse 36, and he will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. What does it mean to blaspheme? Blaspheme means to speak evil or irreverently or profanely against God. And so this coming Antichrist is a blasphemer of God. And in Revelation chapter 13, God amplifies and illustrates this statement. He says, there was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. And he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. And so he will claim to be God, and he will claim to forgive sins. But not only do we see his royal pride, but letter B, we see the religious policy of the coming Antichrist. He's going to have a religious policy. There's going to be a one world religion. There's going to be one thing that he's going to be about. And we see a few things here about him. Under letter B, we notice he will ignore his religious heritage. And notice how I worded that. He will ignore his religious heritage. Look at verse 37. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers. Now, some people have read that, and they've seen it say gods of his fathers, and they will assume from that that he's a Jew because it said God of his fathers. But that can't be here because gods is plural there, right? It's plural. And whenever they've talked about it for the Jews, they've said the God of their fathers. And they're talking about the one true God. If it was the one true God, it would be singular. But also Daniel tells us, and we studied this earlier on, that he comes up from this revived Roman Empire. He comes out of those leaders. Remember the 10 kings? And then an 11th pops up, and this is that one ruler. And so he can't be a Jew. He's going to come out of this Roman Empire. But the idea is, when he talks about gods of his fathers, and what I think this means, is that he will reject his religious background. A lot of people are doing that now. They're rejecting their religious backgrounds. But he will be different. Then he'll be different than other people by how he views God. and he rejects whatever he grew up with, whatever religion that was. Notice, secondly, he will not desire who women desire. And notice again how I worded this point. He will not desire who women desire. Look at verse 37 again. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women. Now, what does this mean? And this is a difficult expression to interpret. It's hard to interpret. And you should have a clue by what I wrote in the point that he will not desire who women desire. But please note what it does not say. It does not say that he will not have a desire for women. People have said that that's what it means. It doesn't speak of a desire for women, but the desire of women. What does it mean? Well, we can say that at least what it means, we kind of look at it, that at least it means he will not have a normal sexual drive such that he would not want to have a relationship with his wife or another woman. That's at least what it means. I don't think so. Or it could mean that he has no capacity for normal affection for a family. Could mean that. Listen to this verse, 2 Timothy 3:1-3. This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good. Now, I read that from the King James Version because I like how it renders it there. It says, without natural affection. And what it says is that the family, as God designed it, will break down, and we've already seen that happen now. So it could mean that he won't have normal affection for his family. Some people think that it means that he will be a homosexual when he talks about the desire of women. But here's another way to look at this statement. And let's read it again, verse 37. Remember, he's talking about his blasphemous nature and religious heritage. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women. Now, what is the desire of women? Well, I can't speak for all women, but when we look back at this time, what women would he be talking about? He'd be talking about Jewish women, right? And all in pre-Messianic times, before Christ was born, Jewish women all had one desire. They wanted to be mothers. Mothers of who? Who? The Messiah. They were thinking, they knew the prophecies, they knew that Christ would come from a virgin, and they were all hoping, they wanted to be the one that would carry this promised seed of the woman. In other words, they wanted to be the one who would carry the Messiah. And so we could take this verse to mean that he will show no regard for his religious heritage, we saw that, nor for the one that is desired by Jewish women. Do you see that? It's still talking about his religion. He's not going to look at the God of his fathers. He has no regard for Jesus Christ. And so you can scratch your head for a little while and then go back and listen to the message again later. But notice we see again, thirdly, that he will demand to be the sole object of worship. This is all about worship and him setting himself up to be God. And that's how we see the context of the verse. The whole verse, verse 37. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. See, this is all talking about worship. He will oppose all worship except the worship of himself. But he's not only a believer in the ecumenical movement, he's the movement himself. He's an egotist. He's so full of himself that he will want everyone to wear his name on their bodies. Remember that whole thing about 666 that we see in Revelation? That's the number of his name. People have to wear it on themselves. We'll look at that when we get to Revelation. And there's going to be severe punishment for those who don't wear it. Now let's see thirdly, the real purpose of the coming Antichrist. The real purpose. And we're going to look at verse 38. He said, "But instead, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures." The word fortresses means God of war. And I'm sure you would ask, as I would, who is this God that the Antichrist will worship? It's none other than Satan himself. God with a small g. Jesus said that Satan came to kill, steal, and destroy. And it was Satan who offered Jesus the kingdoms of this world. And when you think about Christ's temptation, when he was offered in exchange for his worship the kingdoms of this world, Christ never disputed Satan's right to offer that. Satan had a right to make the offer to Christ. And the Antichrist will be the one that will accept that offer. He will say to Satan, I'll take that offer. And he will become a world dictator. And in order to take the world, he will need military power, which Satan will give to him. He will put it in his hands. Look at verse 39. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him and will cause them to rule over the many and will parcel out land for a price. And so he will attack anywhere he wants. And there will be no world power, not even the strongest of fortresses, that will be able to stand against him. He will go over all of them. And one way or another, all the world's superpowers will be forced to acknowledge him because he will come with deception and he will develop a war machine that is unparalleled. And so if you're in heaven at this time, which if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you will be in heaven at this time, that will be the best place to be. But if you're on the earth, that will be the worst place to be, as we see in verse 39, where he takes the kingdoms of this world and he will buy people's allegiances. He will put people in leadership and cause them to be rulers. And then in verse 39, it talks about the fact that he will parcel out land for a price. And so he gives positions of leadership and possessions of land in order to get people's loyalty. So with that being said, let's look next at the battles of the Antichrist. The battles of the Antichrist, number 3. And this section opens up in verse 40, and it tells us first about the Antichrist's rivals. It tells about his rivals, all right? Everybody caught up? We're going to be in verse 40, all right? Letter A is his rivals. Look at verse 40. At the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. Now, in the first half of the tribulation, he is unchallenged. But now he has some rivals. Now remember, we talked about directions in the Bible, that all directions given in the Bible is in relation to Israel. And so when it talks about the king of the north, we look north of Israel. We talk about the king of the south, we look south of Israel. All right? So who are these two kings? Well, the king of the south, who we talked about before, is the king of Egypt, and the king of the north is the king of Syria. So we see those two rivals. Remember, last time and the time before, we were talking about something that happened, 2,600 years ago. This now will be the future. So these rivalries come up again. The king of the south and king of the north, they pop their heads back in there again. And they're going to come back on the world stage during the tribulation period. And so they will be united in their hatred against the Antichrist. If you remember in history, they were going against each other. And they were going through Israel, sometimes killing Jews in the process. But in this case, they're united together, king of the north, king of the south, against the Antichrist, and they will attack him. But he will fight back. What will he use? It tells us in the verse we just read, chariots, horsemen, and many ships. But in addition to his rivals, we see letter B, the Antichrist's revenge. The idea is even though they attack, they will not succeed. Look at verse 40 again, second half. And he will enter countries, overthrow them, and pass through. So he will march in, he'll overthrow them, and he will stay strong right until the coming of Christ. We see in verse 41, he will also enter the beautiful land. Remember, the beautiful land is Israel. And so after overthrowing those two kingdoms, the king of the south, king of the north, Egypt and Syria, he will go back into Israel, and it seems from this verse that many other countries will also fall in addition to Egypt and Syria. We're not told who they are, but it says in the end of verse 39 that there are many other countries that were overthrown. But then we will see that there are 3 countries that will be spared. Look at verse 41, and Cam, you can start putting that map up. 41. In the middle, and many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. Now, if you take a look at this chart that we've placed on the screen, what do we know about these countries from the Old Testament as they relate to Israel? You see them there? Edom, Moab, and Ammon. They all have arrows pointing to them. But they were some of Israel's greatest enemies back in the Old Testament times. And the piece of land that occupies that spot today is called Jordan. Go to the next map, Cam. You can see the modern day depiction of it. And you can see Jordan today occupies that section of land that Edom, Moab, and Ammon from the Old Testament had occupied. And so Daniel was writing, they hated the Jews. Now, we don't have time to go into all the reasons. There are some very specific reasons why they hated the Jews. We'll save that for some other time. But it was a deep-seated hatred. All right? Everybody with me? Now, this is interesting. All right? Now, why these 3 are spared, we don't know. Why are they spared? Other countries are taken. We see on the map Egypt is taken and Syria to the top is taken, but that area is spared. Now, my thought is that because they've been Israel's enemies for so long, Satan will say, it's my gift to you. We're going to spare these 3. It'll be the devil's gift to the Antichrist. But many people will flee as a result. So here's a man who's the Antichrist, who comes initially as Mr. Peace, the first half of the 7 years, but will in the second half of the tribulation become Mr. War. He will go into the temple, declare himself to be God. People will come against him. He will be all about Mr. War. Now notice verse 42 in your text. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. But he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over the precious things of Egypt, and Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. He will pursue the defeated Egypt to their land, and he will plunder their treasures. Think about all the treasures that are in Egypt right now. All priceless stuff. Libya and Ethiopia will also be attacked, defeated, and plundered, and he will become the richest person on the planet. But his end is going to come. Because notice letter C, the Antichrist's rage. Notice his rage. And we see in verse 44, but rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. Verse 45, he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Now, to add to his misery, he will hear of another invasion from the east and the north. And so to prepare himself, it says in verse 45 that he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. It says here in the verse, he will be between the seas. What does that mean? That's a reference to the 2 major seas. Cam, put that third chart up. The two major seas in that area, the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea. All right? If you see from this chart, you could see both seas circled in red there. And then the holy mountain that he refers to in the verse is Mount Moriah. And so I circled the approximate area there in yellow for you. This is where the rebuilt temple will be, and near there is a place called Megiddo, or Armageddon. Perhaps you've heard of that place, because a big battle will take place. Cam, leave that up. But Revelation 9:16 says, the number of the armies of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them. The Apostle John, just like Daniel, speaks of a great army from the east, with this army of 200 million men. Now, we don't know who this army is. Doesn't tell us. But people have speculated that it's China. China is the only army that has boasted before of 200 million in their army. And they're east of Israel. And so it could be true. But look at verse 44. But rumors from the east, could be China, possibly, and from the north will disturb him. And he will go forth with wrath to destroy and annihilate many. But in addition to the rumors from the east, there is also an army from the north who will assemble to go against the Antichrist. And there's a whole description of this army. If you want to write next to verse 44, Ezekiel 38 and 39, those two chapters, it describes this army from the north. And like I mentioned last time, this isn't Syria. We talked about the king of the north being Syria, the king of the south being Egypt. But this army from the north is not Syria. You go north of Israel and you go all the way up, you see Russia. Ezekiel 38 and 39 will use this name Rosh. And if you take the word down into this time, it's Russia. And that's what he talks about in Ezekiel. And so they're going to form some sort of coalition. And so you will have the coalition of China and Russia going against the Antichrist and his armies, which we have seen will be the revived Roman Empire. And they will gather for this battle on this place called Megiddo, that circle there. Revelation 16:12 says, the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river, the Euphrates, and its water was dried up so that the way would be prepared for the kings from the east. And so God supernaturally dries up this river to prepare for the big army. Keep listening as I read Revelation 16:13. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. For they are spirits of demons performing signs, which go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. And so he's talking about demons who will control the leaders of the world, and he will get them to get together to come to this battle against the Antichrist. Revelation 16:16 tells us, and they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Har-Mageddon, or Armageddon. And so the Antichrist is working with these demons to achieve victory at the battle of Armageddon. But he will not achieve the victory that he wants. Because we see letter D, and you could switch, Cam, the Antichrist's ruin, his ruin. He's going to come to an end. Look at verse 45. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. How will this happen? Basically, the 7 years of the tribulation is over. Revelation gives the details. Revelation 19:19. And I saw the beasts and the kings of the earth and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. Remember, when we see the term beast, it's referring to the Antichrist, right? Verse 20, and the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone. So Satan, the false prophet, and the Antichrist will spend eternity in the lake of fire. And it won't just be them. Because it says in Revelation 20 and verse 15, and if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown in the lake of fire. And so what we have to remember is just as literally as the 135 prophecies in verses 1 to 35 were fulfilled, even so the prophecies concerning the coming Antichrist and his ultimate ruin will also be fulfilled. And all prophecy, when we hear it and when we rightly understand it, it should change us. We should be spurned to change. We should be driven to change. Let me explain this from Luke chapter 17. Don't turn there. We'll have it put up. Jesus is speaking about his return. All right? Listen carefully and read it along on the screens with me. Just read it in your hearts. And just as it happened in the days of Noah, so it will also be in the days of the Son of Man. So the days of the Son of Man are right before Christ returns. Let's keep reading. Verse 27. They were eating, they were drinking, they were marrying, they were being given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed all of them. So that's the days of Noah. He's likening the end times to the days of Noah. He says people were just doing things as normal. They were carrying on as if nothing was going to be different. But then Jesus, in the same passage, he jumps to Lot. Remember Lot? Verse 28. It was the same as happened in the days of Lot. They were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were planting, they were building. But on the day that Lot went out from Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Verse 30, it will be just the same on the day of the Son of Man is that the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, the one who is on the housetop and whose goods are in the house must not go down to take them out, and likewise, the one who is in the field must not turn back. Do you remember that whole situation with Lot? He lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, and before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, and up to the day that it was destroyed, people were living life as usual. They didn't have a care in the world. But Jesus, and what did God do? He used angels. He grabbed Lot out of there. Yanked him out of there. But Jesus makes this great statement in verse 32. Look at it. Remember Lot's wife. Great statement. Now let's think about this for a little bit. And I need everybody to listen very carefully. This is very important. Before Jesus comes back, it will be like the days of Noah and the days of Lot. Think about the flood. Do you remember that? 420 years, Noah's preaching. He's saying, it's going to rain, repent, come on the ark. People ignored him. They were doing everything for the 420 years. Some people said, why didn't God wait 421 years? Well, if 420 isn't enough, then would 421 be enough? And right before God poured out his wrath on the earth, he took Noah and his family and he put them safely on the ark and he closed the door. And just before he obliterated Sodom and Gomorrah, he took Lot out safely. And just before God pours out his wrath on the earth in the end of the tribulation period, he will take his people, the church, those who are born again, those who are saved, he will take them out of the earth through the rapture, through the catching up. And in that time, just like in the former time, there will be three classes of people living on the earth. First, there will be the Noah-type people. Noah pictures a spirit-filled Christian, someone who loves God, who obeys God, and who walks with God. And because that was the pattern of Noah's life, he was godly. He was a godly influence on his family. And when it was time for the flood, all his family was saved. He was able to preach to his family, and his family responded. They were all saved. And when they came out of the ark, they came out to a full reward, and they could carry on the earth. And that's what it will be like for some Christians. They have a pattern of life that influences others for Christ, and Christ will reward them. But there will also be a second class of people. There will be Lot-type people. And Lot pictures a backslidden or carnal Christian. You know what I mean by that? A Christian who's living for the world. The one who used to live for God, but they don't live for God anymore. And even though Lot got out of Sodom, how did he get out? Go back and look at the story. He was dragged out by the hand. And most of his loved ones, except for his daughters, were left behind. And everything that he had invested his whole life into went up in smoke. Now, in case you're wondering, was Lot saved? We know that Lot was saved because of what we see in 2 Peter 2:7. And if he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by sensual conduct of unprincipled men, he called him righteous Lot. And Lot represents the Christian who will lose all reward at the judgment seat of Christ. Even though they get into heaven, they will get no reward. And I'll tell you what. If you're a carnal Christian, you may go to heaven, and some of your family may go to heaven, but many may not. And many of your friends will go to hell. Why? Because you're living a lukewarm life. But there's a third type of person. There will be Lot's wife type of people. You remember what Jesus said in that verse? Luke 17:32. Very profound verse. Remember Lot's wife. Lot's wife pictures the unsaved person. She had a heart for the world. What happened to her? God said, don't look back. And what did she do? Everybody knows this account? She turned back and she turned to a pillar of salt, right? She died. She had a heart for the world. Her heart was in the world. She longed for what Sodom had. She didn't want to leave. So even though she initially was dragged out, what did she do? She utilized her free will and she did what God said she should not do. And she turned back and she was turned into a pillar of salt and she was lost for all of eternity. And today she's in hell. So what kind of person are you? Are you like Noah? Are you like Lot? Or are you like Lot's wife? The Noahs of this world will receive great reward. The Lots of this world will experience great regret. The Lot's wife of this world will experience great wrath. And if you're a Noah, keep going. If you're a Lot, then change your ways. Stop being lukewarm. Get on fire for the Lord. But if you're a Lot's wife, you need to repent today, because if you died today, you would go to hell. But everyone wants to go to heaven. I haven't personally met anyone yet that I've talked to that said that they want to go to hell. I've heard about some people who've said that, but I personally haven't met anyone. But if you want to go to heaven, you must make preparations now. You have to reserve your spot while you're alive. You have to RSVP now, because one day you will stand before God and He will ask you, why should I let you into my heaven? And if you can't say for sure that I've made my reservation by placing my trust in Jesus, then you won't get in. I'm sorry when you read stuff out there that says, in the end, God's just going to let everybody in. That's not the case. Maybe you heard this account from Ruth Anna Metzger, who's a professional singer. And she tells a story that shows how important it is to have your name written down ahead of time. She says this, and I'll read her account. Several years ago, she was asked to sing at the wedding of a very wealthy man. According to the invitation, the reception would be held at the top 2 floors of Seattle's Columbia Tower, the Northwest's tallest skyscraper. She and her husband Roy were excited about attending, and so after singing at the wedding, they headed to the reception. At the reception, waiters in tuxedos offered luscious hors d'oeuvres and exotic beverages. The bride and groom approached a beautiful glass and brass staircase that led up to the top floor. Someone ceremoniously cut a satin ribbon draped across the bottom of the stairs, and they announced the wedding feast was about to begin. Bride and groom ascended the stairs, followed by their guests. By the way, this is something that happened to her. At the top of the stairs, a maitre d' with a bound book greeted the guest outside the doors. "May I have your name, please?" "I am Ruth Anna Metzger, and this is my husband, Roy." He searched the M's. "I'm not finding it. Would you spell it, please?" Ruth Anna spelled her name slowly. After searching the book, the maitre d' looked up and said, "I'm sorry, but your name isn't here. There must be some mistake," Ruth Anna replied. "I'm the singer. I sang for the wedding." The gentleman answered, "It doesn't matter who you are or what you did. Without your name in the book, you cannot attend the banquet." He motioned to a waiter and said, "Show these people to the service elevator, please." The Metzgers followed the waiter past beautifully decorated tables laden with shrimp and whole smoked salmon and magnificent carved ice sculptures. And adjacent to the banquet area, an orchestra was preparing to perform, the musicians all dressed in dazzling white tuxedos. The waiter led Ruth Anna and Roy to the service elevator, ushered them in, and pushed G for the parking garage. After locating their car and driving several miles in silence, Roy reached over and put his hands on Ruth Anna's arm and said, "Sweetheart, what happened?" She said, "When the invitation arrived, I was busy," she replied. "I never bothered to RSVP. Besides, I was the singer. Surely I could go to the reception without returning the RSVP." Ruth Anna started to cry, not only because she had missed the most lavish banquet she'd ever been invited to, but also because she suddenly had a small taste of what it will be like someday for people as they stand before Christ and find that their names are not written in the Lamb's Book of Life. The only thing is that this elevator won't stop at the garage. It will go straight to hell. You see, throughout the ages, countless people have been too busy to respond to Christ's invitation to his wedding banquet to heaven. Many assume that they have done good enough, or the good that they've done, perhaps attending church, maybe being baptized, singing in the choir, serving people from the soup kitchen. They think all of that will be good enough to gain entry into heaven, but that's not what gets us into heaven. This whole service today has been about Jesus Christ. It's all about those who have accepted the sacrifice of Christ that he made on the cross by his death and his shed blood. And so the question is, have you said yes to Christ? If so, then you have reason to rejoice. Heaven's gates will be open to you. And if you have not yet, the fact that you're here and alive, the gates are still opened. Let's pray. Still time to make your RSVP if you have not. Maybe you're here this morning and you realize you're not saved, you're not born again. And if Christ were to come back for his church, you would not be part of that. Well, the mere fact that you're here and you're sitting here means that God has not given up on you yet. You can still respond. You can still be saved. Is that you this morning? Do you need to be saved? I urge you right now to respond. Don't wait till this afternoon. Don't wait till this evening. Don't wait till tomorrow. If you feel within your heart that you need to respond, you respond right now. And you say, Lord Jesus, save me. I realize that you came as a sacrifice for my sin. And I ask you to forgive me. Save my soul. Wash me clean. Make me who you want me to be. Can you respond that way? Listen, nobody's looking around. If you responded this morning, you prayed to receive Christ, would you just slip your hand up? I'm the only one looking out. You need to receive Christ. Folks, if you're not saved, God is still being patient, and he's still waiting. He's still waiting to enter our hearts. I'm just going to ask Esther to play for a little bit and give us some time to just look within our hearts. And as she plays, and as our heads are still bowed and eyes are still closed, and if you want to respond, and if you want to talk with somebody about how to receive Christ, I'll be standing right up front, just as she plays. Just slip out from where you are, and you come up and you say, Pastor, I want to learn more about Christ and how I receive Christ. Would you talk to me about that? I'll be standing right there. Everybody else is praying for you. And as we're here, you respond.